Thanks to everyone involved in organising this conference. My name is MacRae. I'm an anthropologist teaching at Massey University in New Zealand and researching mostly in Indonesia and sometimes in India. The term extraction tends to be used pretty loosely, but its literal meaning is to do with physically pulling something out of its natural setting, hence extractive industries, or removing a tooth from a gum or jawbone. In a more social context, it can also be used to refer forensically to knowledge or information, extracting a confession or extracting the truth. And in more sinister register, cross-cultural metaphors of the blood-sucking vampire and its contemporary manifestation in the extraction of organs from living bodies. We'll come back to that, but meanwhile, extraction usually refers to any process by which we liberate stuff out of the natural world. Tapping rubber, concentrating maple syrup, distilling alcohol, THC out of cannabis plants, opium out of poppies, timber out of forests, crops out of the soil, fish out of the sea, DNA or pharmaceutical agents out of plants and animals. And these are sometimes referred to as extracts. There's a lot we could say about the origins of modern extractionism in colonial economies, but I don't think we've really got time for that today. Instead, I want to tell you a little story that illustrates the logic of contemporary extraction on a fairly small scale. Sand is ground down particles of rock, and there's lots of it around. It's always been useful for some things like making glass and mixing with lime and, more recently, Portland cement to make mortars and concrete. And concrete is useful stuff too. We can make all sorts of useful and interesting things with it. Concrete has its legitimate uses, but through the 20th century we started building more and bigger, and concrete became the material of choice, everywhere from the commercial skyscrapers of New York to the houses of the less affluent all over the world. Concrete needs cement, which is a energy horror story more than an extraction one, but it also needs sand, a lot of it. And now demand for sand is rising exponentially, and there's not enough of the right kind of sand to go around. The price of sand has also risen exponentially, and now there are sand cartels, sand mafias, and sand wars. All of this has been fairly well documented, and it's probably not news to most of us. But my little story is about a small, out-of-the-way sand frontier I know quite well, because it illustrates the way the frontier intersection of resource and value works itself out in practice, which is often quite untidy and complex. Most of my research since the 1990s has been in Bali. A few years ago I drove up a famously beautiful road into the mountains, which I hadn't been on for a while. All the way up there was a constant stream of trucks coming the other way down the hill, and I discovered they were full of sand and gravel, dug out of the side of the most sacred mountain, which is also a very active volcano. Back in the small town, which is my home base, I began to notice all the piles of black sand on the roadsides in front of houses, usually being carried somewhere by lines of women with buckets or trays on their heads. Each pile of sand was destined for a building site, some of them quite small, but some quite large. Bali has for some years been experiencing a building boom, accelerating in both the number and the scale of projects. This boom is driven by the ever-growing tourism boom, which is attracting ever larger scales of investment from ever further afield. The value in the building boom is complex. On the face of it, it's investment with a view to extracting value from the tourism resource: hotels, restaurants, travel and transport, and all the secondary service industries that feed off them. But some of it is also investment in a growing real estate market, and some is simply laundering of money extracted in other ways from other places. But it all involves building, and the materials of choice are no longer bamboo and thatch, but steel, glass, and especially concrete, plus rock and gravel for fill and base courses. A few decades ago, most concrete and fill in Bali was made using sand from ground up coral reefs, but now they've all gone. So the next source is the pumice and lava fields on the flanks and in the craters of volcanoes in the middle of the island. Doesn't need much extracting, you just dig it up, sieve it into finer and coarser components and truck it away. All those little volcano-shaped piles of black sand around my town arrive on trucks from up the hill, often at night, because it's easier to get into town and dump your load and then get out again. If we follow the trucks out of town, we'd see them heading back up the hill to Mount Batur, then down into its huge crater. At dawn, they start again, prowling the small road that circles the crater floor and the smaller tracks that crisscross between. Beside the main road, people are sieving sand under crude shelters. If somebody flags a driver down, he stops. They load up his truck, he pays them, and he heads off again. Each day, at least 1,500 overloaded trucks grind and wind their way up the crater wall. At the top, they change gear and speed away downhill to the centres of the building boom. Around my neighbourhood, the standard price for a truck of sand is about $120. But if you know a driver, he might deliver it direct for $100, especially after dark. The sand, gravel and rocks are from lava flows and blowholes in the side of the volcano. This new resource boom is part of an unprecedented economic boom among the communities on the crater floor, who were previously among the poorest in Bali. Much of it is ordinary people digging up their own backyards and anywhere else they can find. But there are larger operations too, also locally owned, with diggers and trucks excavating open cut pits 10 or more metres deep and tens of metres wide. These expand across the landscape, stopping only when they come to a house or a road, village or temple, many of which now perch at the top of unstable cliffs. This is frontier enterprise, classic Wild West style, fast, competitive and unregulated. Fortunes are made and lost, environments are destroyed, and in the end the resource runs out. But as in most modern resource frontiers, it is not outside corporations exploiting local communities and environments. In Batur, it is the local community destroying their own environment, fouling their own nest. Like most frontiers stories, this is a long and tangled tale. But to misquote Anat Singh, it makes no sense to blame extraction on its poorest participants. The people of the crater have always been poor, but now it's their turn for a slice of the action, for what you might call perversely grassroots or community-based economic development. What they are doing is clearly unsustainable, but it's also illegal and everybody knows it. The local police and army posts know too and would be prepared to stop it, but only if the district government asks them to. The head of the district is from Batur, and one of his biggest vote banks is the village largely responsible for the mining. However, there is another authority in Batur. The old gentleman, second from your right in the fuzzy dressing gown, is the high priest of the great temple on the crater rim, a Dalai Lama type figure in these mountains. He's renovated temples to protect key ecological sites around the crater and planted gardens and orchards which nobody would dare to violate. Anyone mining inside of the temple receives a polite delegation which few would ignore. But his jurisdiction extends only over the western half of the crater. Out of sight of the temple and further west, the free-for-all goes on. Further east, sorry. The ecological damage is beginning to show. Watercourses in the lake itself are silting up. Chemical runoffs from intensive agriculture, that's the other boom, are polluting the lake, and landslides occur after heavy rain. A few years ago, the water of the lake suddenly changed colour and all the fish in the fish farms, that's another boom, died. In 2012, the main village in the crater began to flood and people had to flee to higher ground. The high priest says these events may be no coincidence, and he suspects the goddess of the lake may not be happy. I'm not sure whether they're still digging since COVID-19 stopped most things and the human world shut down for a few weeks. The mystery we call the economy pretty much ground to a halt because we stopped consuming and producing things we didn't really need. Demand for oil dropped, as did the price and rate of extraction. We also stopped extracting all sorts of other things. It was pretty tough for a lot of people who were dependent on the system, but it was pretty good for the environment and for most other species. It also revealed very clearly our unhealthy dependence on all of this consumption, production and extraction. A few months ago, if we can remember the world before coronavirus, we may remember it was a dry summer and water was running out in New Zealand. Where I live in a remote valley in Coromandel, the tanks that have supplied 15 households from a spring in the hill were emptying faster than it could feed them. Our options were pumping directly from streams, which were the lowest we've ever seen them, or finding a better source. We found a good one further up the valley, built a small dam, cleared a track and hauled a new pipe up there. It worked and we could all start watering our gardens again and having showers rather than jumping in the stream. We were very pleased with ourselves, but it also occurred to me that we were doing exactly what frontier societies have always done, over-extracting or under-conserving a resource, then going and finding another one to extract. This way of thinking, we can call it extractionism, has remained a deeply taken for granted way of dealing with increased consumption and resource shortages. All you do is find a new source to extract from. And finally, the more we look at things through this lens of extraction, the more deeply rooted this unreflected ideology of extractionism seems to be. For example, we could at this point detour into the extractive practices of the Harvey Weinsteins and Jeffrey Epsteins of this world. But let's go even closer to home, to our own intellectual and academic culture. Here is a prominent photojournalist reflecting on his practice. Us anthropologists have always given ourselves a hard time about the colonial roots and extractivism's slippery slope, never far from the surface of our ethnographic practice. But we're still not sure what to do about it. However, when I see the way some other disciplines conduct their research, I realise that while anthropologists are at least reflexively aware of it, it is so deeply embedded in the structure of standard academic research practice as to be virtually hidden in plain view. The practices and discourses of ethics committees and the system of research and publishing incentives of our universities are good places to see this self-deception at work. And that's before we even start talking about our university's relationships with international students, or come to think of it, with its own academic staff. And finally, when I see a new research frontier opening up based on extracting value from the rich new resource vein of COVID-19, on one hand, it seems like an obvious and necessary and responsible place to be going with our research projects. But at the same time, I can't help wondering what it says about our roles as critic and conscience of extractivism. But that may be as far as we want to pursue this line of thought for now. Thank you.